The wind came low across the prairie, flattening the grass and pressing it down as if the land itself wished to forget its own height. It carried grit and the smell of old snow, though spring had already been promised by the calendar. She stood at the edge of the homestead yard with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching the boards of the barn door shudder. Her breath came shallow, not from cold alone. Her body had learned a different kind of weather these past months, one that lived inside her bones. The house behind her was quiet in the way of places that had been lived in hard and then abandoned. A kettle sat cold on the stove. A child's boot lay on its side by the door. The silence did not feel restful. It felt watchful. Her name was Clara Boone, and she had been a widow for 14 months. She had stopped counting the days after the first winter passed, after the earth thawed and gave nothing back. Her husband lay on a hill overlooking the creek, marked by a plank she had carved herself, letters, uneven from hands that shook with more than grief. The children had watched her carve it, their faces solemn, their eyes too old for their years. That morning her legs trembled as she crossed the yard. It was not fear that made them weak. It was the slow, burning ache that had been growing in her chest for weeks, the way her vision sometimes narrowed, as if the world were closing its fist around her. She knew enough to know she was unwell. She also knew enough to know there was no one to send for. Inside the house, her 2 children slept on a shared mattress near the hearth. Eli, 8 years old, lay curled with his thumb tucked under his chin, his breathing steady and deep. Anna, 5, clutched a rag doll with a stitched smile, her hair tangled across her face. Clara paused in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. The room tilted slightly, then settled. She thought of the doctor in town, the one who had visited once after her husband died and told her gently that rest was a kind of medicine. She had laughed then, not from humor but disbelief. Rest was a word for other people. She turned away before the children could wake and see her like this. By midday the sky had grown pale and brittle. Clara tried to mend a tear in Ellie's shirt, but her fingers refused the needle. It slipped, pricking her skin, drawing a bead of red. She watched it well up, oddly fascinated, then wiped it on her apron. Her heart hammered too fast, then slowed until each beat felt like it had to push through mud. When she stood, the room darkened. She caught the table, but her knees folded anyway. The floor rose to meet her, hard and cold. For a moment she let herself lie there. The ceiling beams blurred. The weight in her chest spread heavy as a stone. This was how it would end, a small and quiet ending, unnoticed by the wide land outside. She thought of the children waking, of Anna's small voice calling for her, of Eli trying to be brave. The thought cut sharper than pain. Clara rolled onto her side and forced herself up inch by inch, dragging her body across the floor until she reached the cupboard. She pulled it open and took out the last jar of preserved peaches. She had been saving it for what she no longer knew. She set the jar on the table and called the children's names. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin but steady enough. They came running, hair wild, feet bare. She smiled for them, though her vision swam. She spooned peaches into tin bowls, watching them eat, memorizing the sound of their chewing, the way Eli wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, the way Anna hummed without knowing it. "I need you to listen," Clara said when the bowls were empty. The children looked up, faces sticky and serious. She took a breath that felt like glass in her lungs. "If Mama needs to lie down," she said slowly, "you stay inside. You keep the door shut. Ellie, you watch your sister. You understand me?" Eli nodded, jaw tight. Anna frowned but nodded too. Clara reached out and touched their heads, one hand on each, grounding herself in the warmth of them. The world beyond the window did not soften. The wind kept moving. The prairie did not care. But Clara did. And because she did, she chose to stand again, though it hurt, though the choice might cost her everything she had left. The afternoon stretched thin as old cloth. Clara lay on the bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, listening to the house settle. Each breath felt borrowed. She kept her eyes open because when she closed them, the darkness came too fast like a hand over her face. From the other room she heard Eli moving quietly, the scrape of a chair leg, the careful sound of him pouring water without spilling. He was trying to be what he thought she needed. The knowledge filled her with a grief sharper than the pain in her chest. Time passed without shape. Light shifted along the wall, the sun lowering the color of it, going from white to the soft gold of evening. Clara thought of the years before the land hardened her. She remembered a smaller house back east, remembered rain that fell straight down instead of sideways, remembered her husband laughing as he carried her over a threshold that had not yet learned the weight of sorrow. Those memories came unbidden like ghosts who did not know they were no longer welcome. Her husband's hands had been gentle, strong but careful. He had believed the land could be reasoned with if you worked hard enough. The winter that took him proved otherwise. A fever quick and merciless burning through him while the snow sealed the roads. Clara had sat by the bed and pressed cloths to his skin, whispering promises she did not know how to keep. When he died, the world had not paused. The cold did not lift. The children did not stop kneading. She stirred now, forcing herself upright. The room swayed but held. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and waited until the pounding in her ears slowed. Outside, the wind carried a different sound, something rhythmic and heavy. Hooves. Her heart jumped then steadied. Travelers passed by sometimes, but rarely this close. She stood and made her way to the window. A man on horseback had stopped near the edge of the yard. He sat tall in the saddle hat, pulled low coat dusted with pale dirt. The horse lowered its head, blowing softly. Clara hesitated. Pride rose first, sharp and instinctive. She did not want help. Wanting it felt like a failure she could not afford. Then her chest tightened again, stealing her breath, and pride loosened its grip. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his face as he took in her pallor, the way she leaned on the doorframe. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm, carrying easily across the space. "You all right?" She nodded out of habit, then shook her head. The truth felt heavy but necessary. "No," she said. The word came out steady, though her knees threatened otherwise. He dismounted quickly, movements practiced but not rushed. He tied the horse and came closer, stopping a respectful distance away. Up close she saw the lines around his eyes, the weathered look of someone who had spent more time outside than in. His gaze flicked past her, taking in the house, the yard, the signs of a life stretched thin. "My name's Thomas Reed," he said. "I was riding through. Thought I heard something fall." "It was me," Clara said. "I fell earlier." She did not know why she added it. Perhaps because she was tired of holding things upright. Thomas nodded as if falling were an ordinary fact. "Is there someone else here?" "My children," she swallowed. "They're inside." He glanced toward the door, then back to her face. "May I help?" The question was simple. It did not assume, did not press. Clara felt something in her loosen, a knot she had been carrying without noticing. She stepped aside. Inside, Eli stood stiffly near the table, Anna half hidden behind him. Thomas removed his hat as soon as he crossed the threshold. He crouched to their level, his voice softening. "Evening," he said. "Your mother looks like she could use a bit of rest. Mind if I help her get settled?" Eli hesitated, then nodded. His eyes never left Clara. Thomas moved with care, one hand ready but not touching until she leaned toward him. His arm was solid, steady. He guided her back to the bed, propping pillows, fetching water without being asked. He did not speak much, and she was grateful for it. When she lay back, the room no longer spun. The pain remained, but dulled as if it had finally been acknowledged. Thomas stood near the door, uncertain. "I can stay the night," he said. "There's a town a few miles on. I can ride for a doctor in the morning." Clara closed her eyes. The thought of morning felt far away but not impossible. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the wind kept moving across the prairie, indifferent as ever. Inside, for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to rest while someone else stood watch. Saddle up and subscribe. There are more stories waiting beyond the horizon. Night settled slowly, the kind that crept in rather than falling all at once. Thomas built up the fire, feeding it small pieces so it would last. He moved quietly, aware of every sound he made, as if the house itself were something fragile. Clara drifted in and out of sleep, the pain in her chest easing enough that each breath no longer felt like a test she might fail. When she woke, it was to the low murmur of voices. Eli sat at the table, his legs swinging, telling Thomas about the creek that flooded every spring and the calf that had been born weak and lived anyway. Anna leaned against Thomas's knee, her doll forgotten on the floor. Thomas listened as if the stories mattered, nodding, asking small questions. He did not interrupt. He did not hurry them along. Clara watched from the bed, unseen, something tight in her throat. She had forgotten what it looked like for her children to be children, to speak without fear that they were asking too much. Later, when the children slept, Thomas sat on a chair by the hearth, his hat resting on his knees. Clara shifted the quilt, whispering. He looked up at once. "You need anything?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just water." He brought it, careful not to spill. She drank, then held the cup in both hands, feeling its warmth. "You didn't have to stay." He shrugged slightly. "Seemed right." The fire popped softly. Outside, a coyote called its cry, long and lonely. Clara stared at the ceiling, gathering words she had not planned to speak. "I'm not used to company." "I gathered," Thomas said, not unkindly. She turned her head toward him. In the firelight, his face looked gentler, the hard lines softened by shadow. "What brings you through here?" "Work mostly," he said. "I fix fences, help with harvests, wherever I'm needed." "You don't have a place of your own?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not anymore." She did not press. Silence settled between them, comfortable, broken only by the fire and the wind brushing the walls. Clara felt herself drifting again, but before sleep took her, she said, "My husband believed this land would make us strong." Thomas nodded once. "Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just shows you what you already are." Morning came, gray and thin. Thomas rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and set water to boil. Clara woke to the smell of it, to the sound of him moving. Her chest still ached, but she could sit without dizziness. That felt like a small victory. He helped the children wash and eat, showing Ellie how to cut bread, evenly tying Anna's hair with hands that were careful but not clumsy. Clara watched, absorbing the ordinariness of it, the way he fit into the rhythms of the house without trying to take them over. After breakfast, Thomas saddled his horse. Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, the cold biting but bearable. "You're going to town," she said. He nodded. "I'll bring the doctor back, and some supplies if you tell me what you need." The offer made her chest tighten again, but this time with something close to gratitude. She told him. He listened. The day passed slowly. The doctor came and went, leaving Herb's instructions, a look that told her she had come close to a line she did not want to cross again. Thomas stayed on, fixing a loose hinge, mending a section of fence without being asked. He did not speak of payment. In the days that followed, Clara grew stronger. She learned the feel of her own limits, the warning signs in her body. Thomas remained sleeping in the barn, working from dawn to dusk. They spoke more now, over meals and the quiet moments after the children slept. He told her of his parents, immigrants who had crossed the ocean with nothing but hope and stubbornness. He spoke of a sister buried far from home, of a dream he once had of building something that would last. Clara listened, offering pieces of herself in return. The land did not soften, but she did. She learned to lift water carefully, to rest when needed. She learned that endurance did not always mean doing everything alone. One evening, as the sun burned low and red, Thomas stood beside her at the edge of the yard. Their shoulders did not touch, but they were close enough to feel each other's warmth. "This place," he said quietly. "It could be something." Clara looked out at the prairie, at the hard beauty of it. For the first time, she did not feel entirely alone standing there. The weeks settled into one another, stitched together by work and weather. Clara's strength returned in careful increments. She learned to measure her days by what her body allowed rather than what pride demanded. Thomas never commented on it. He simply adjusted, taking on heavier tasks, leaving lighter ones for her without naming the exchange. It was a kindness that did not bruise her dignity. They worked side by side, mending fence posts, clearing stones from the field. Clara's hands toughened again, the familiar ache in her muscles returning, honest and earned. She found herself watching Thomas when he thought no one noticed, the way he paused to straighten a leaning post, rather than forcing it, the way he spoke to the horse in a low voice that carried patience more than command. At night, after the children slept, they talked, not of love or promises, but of smaller things, of how the creek smelled after rain, of the way loneliness could sound like wind through an empty room. Thomas spoke of his father teaching him to read by lantern light, of his mother saving seeds, year after year, because she believed in seasons she might not live to see. Clara told him about the first winter here, about fear disguised as determination. Trust grew the way grass did on the prairie, slow, nearly invisible, until one day it was simply there. The change did not go unnoticed. A neighbor rode by one afternoon, Rain's loose eyes sharp. He tipped his hat to Clara, then let his gaze linger on Thomas, measuring. Later, word came through town, carried by mouths that had little else to do. A widow should know her place. A man with no land had no business lingering. Clara felt the old doubt creep back in, cold as a shadow. She had built her survival on self-reliance. Letting someone in felt like standing on uncertain ground. One evening, as the wind rose and the children slept, she voiced it. "You could leave," she said quietly. "It would be simpler." Thomas did not answer at once. He stared into the fire, jaw set. "Simpler isn't always better. You don't owe us anything." "I know," he said. Then he looked at her, really looked. "I'm here because I choose to be." The words frightened her with their weight. Choice implied risk. It implied loss. The test came sooner than she expected. A man arrived from town with papers and a stiff expression, speaking of debts left behind, of land that might not be hers to keep. Clara listened, heart pounding the room, feeling suddenly too small. When he left, the house felt hollow. She sat at the table long after, hands folded, staring at nothing. Thomas stood across from her, silent. At last she said, "If I lose this place?" "You won't," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know we won't face it alone." They rode into town together the next day, Clara's hands clenched tight, Thomas steady beside her. They spoke to people who remembered her husband, who remembered her carving that marker with shaking hands. Support came not in grand gestures, but in small ones. A word here, a signature there. Enough. When it was over, Clara stood outside the office, the sky wide above her. She realized her hands were no longer shaking. That night, Thomas did not return to the barn. He stood awkwardly by the door of the house, hat in hand. Clara watched him, understanding dawning with a mixture of fear and warmth. "You can stay," she said. He did. The seasons turned. Winter came again, but it did not take everything this time. The house filled with small signs of permanence. A shelf built for jars. A repaired window that no longer whistled. Laughter that came easier. One evening, Thomas placed a small ring on the table, simple and worn. "I don't have much," he said, "but I have this place in me that wants to belong." Clara thought of the vow she had once made, born of youth and certainty. This vow would be different. Chosen. Earned. "Yes," she said. Spring returned gentle and forgiving. The creek ran clear. Clara stood in the yard, Thomas beside her, Ely and Anna chasing each other through the grass. The land still stretched wide and indifferent, but it no longer felt empty. The house stood solid against the wind smoke rising steady from the chimney. Clara rested a hand on Thomas's arm, feeling the quiet strength there. Ahead lay work and uncertainty and days that would test them, but there was also warmth and choice and a future shaped together. The prairie breathed on vast and open, and within it they built something that would last. The wedding was small, held on a morning when the light came soft and even, as if the sky itself had decided to be gentle. Clara wore a plain dress she had sewn from fabric set aside years ago, the stitches careful, deliberate. Thomas stood beside her, his coat brushed clean, his hands steady. The children hovered close, Ellie solemn, Anna smiling without restraint, a handful of wildflowers clutched tight. There was no preacher from town, only a neighbor who knew the words well enough and spoke them slowly. Clara listened to each one, not as a promise made in hope alone, but as a vow shaped by memory and loss, and the knowledge of what it cost to endure. When she spoke, her voice did not shake. Thomas's eyes did not leave her face. Afterward there was food laid out on rough tables, laughter carried by the wind. Someone played a fiddle, the sound thin but earnest. Clara watched Thomas lift Anna onto his shoulders, heard Eli explain something important to a group of adults who nodded as if it truly mattered. She felt something settle in her chest, warm and steady. Life did not turn easy because of love. The land remained demanding. Storms came without warning. Crops failed some years despite their best efforts. But they met each challenge together. Clara learned the balance of work and rest, honoring the limits of her body without surrendering her strength. Thomas learned the rhythms of the place, the stubborn generosity of it. They built onto the house that summer, adding a room with windows that caught the morning light. Clara planted new fruit trees, small and fragile, believing in seasons yet to come. Thomas took work in town during the winter months, returning each night with stories and tired smiles. The children grew, their laughter filling spaces that once echoed. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the prairie gold, Clara stood at the window, a hand resting on her stomach, feeling the subtle promise of new life. Thomas came up behind her, his presence familiar and sure. He did not speak, only placed his hand over hers. The moment held quiet and complete. She thought of the day she had collapsed on the floor, the fear that had nearly swallowed her. She thought of the choice she had made to live not only for her children but with them, to accept help without shame. The land outside had not changed, but she had. Night came. The house glowed warm against the dark. Clara tucked the children into bed, kissed their foreheads, lingered a moment longer than necessary. When she joined Thomas by the fire, he reached for her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. "This place," he said softly, echoing words spoken long ago. "It's home." Clara nodded. The word felt right now, earned through weather and work and will. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, carrying the familiar sound of the prairie breathing. Inside there was warmth and light, and the steady presence of those she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. She leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, listening to the quiet feeling the future stretched before them, not as a threat but as an open field. Whatever came, they would meet it together. If this story touched a hidden place in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe and walk with us on the dusty road ahead.